Welcome back to Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we resume our exploration of Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Let's continue this journey into profound teachings together. Crafted meticulously by our team, this audiobook is a vessel for sharing Buddha's wisdom. Your support in spreading these teachings matters. Subscribe, like, and share to expand their influence. Let's collectively enrich the world with Buddha's profound guidance. Relax and absorb these teachings' essence as we progress along this enlightening path. Fabricating Against Defilement. May 20, 2008. Last night I talked about 3 aspects to right effort. The right amount of effort in terms of what you're capable of at any particular time, the right attitude to the effort, the ability to generate the desire required for whatever the effort is, and the right type of effort, trying to abandon or to prevent unskillful mental qualities, to give rise to or to develop skillful ones. There is a fourth, though, which is the right amount of effort required by the particular task. As the Buddha points out, there are some unskillful qualities arising in the mind that don't require any effort at all. You simply watch them and they go away. After all, everything that arises from conditions will have to pass away at some point. And some of these things, when they go away, really do go away. That's the last you see of that particular problem. But others come back. And it's not enough to say, well, it went the first time, it'll go away the second time. That's the way things are. That's not the type of attitude the Buddha took. If they keep coming back, it means you have to actually apply serious effort, what he calls exerting a fabrication. It's a technical term. Fabrication is of 3 kinds: bodily, verbal, and mental. Bodily fabrication is the breath. Exerting the breath against an unskillful mental state means checking to see how that mental state has had an effect on the body, and how it gains strength from the effect. For instance, sometimes anger arises in the mind, and it gets into the way you breathe, into your heart rate, into the hormones. And because that's such an unpleasant physical feeling, or series of physical feelings, you're overwhelmed with the desire to get it out of your system. You think that by expressing the anger, saying something harsh or clever, whatever, will keep the feeling from staying bottled up in the body. But that doesn't work at all. It just creates new habits. That you have to give in to the anger every time it comes, otherwise it's going to, as they say in Thai, squeeze your nerves. So you give in and act on the anger and become a fool as a result. The same with lust. If you feel you've got to get it out of your system by acting on it, it simply becomes another unskillful habit. The Buddha, however, offers another alternative. Use the breath to counteract that impulse, that belief. Find where the breath has been changed by that emotion, and consciously breathe in a different way. It doesn't necessarily make the emotion go away, but it does weaken it. It also gives you a place to stand. You can stand in a much more comfortable sense of the body and look at the anger, look at the lust for what it really is. But your ability to do this also depends on the verbal fabrication and the mental fabrication. Verbal fabrication is directed thought and evaluation. Your anger may direct your thoughts at what a bad person that is, but you can consciously direct them in another direction, thinking for instance of the person's good points. Then you can evaluate the situation to see which way of thinking is better for you, better for the situation. In other words, you learn how to think in a different way, focus on different issues, and actually talk yourself out of the anger, talk yourself out of the lust. This depends in turn on the mental fabrication, the feeling and the perception that go along with the original defilement. This means first actually perceiving it as a defilement. This is one of our big problems. As the Buddha said, the main problem with the hindrances, for instance, is you see things in line with them. When sensual desire arises, you think that the object of the desire really is something worth desiring. Ill will arises and that person really is despicable, really should suffer. Sleepiness arises and you think, well, it's a good time to sleep. Restlessness and anxiety arise, and you think that the issues they focus on really are things you have to worry about. Or doubt arises, and you think your doubts are justified. In other words, these things hoodwink you into seeing things in their terms. If something likable arises in the mind, all you can see is its attractive side. If something you don't like arises, all you can see is its unattractive side. To pull yourself out from under the influence of these things, you have to recognize that they are defilements. Then you have to learn how to perceive the issue in a different way. Look for the stress. Look for the results of going after that attractive thing. And see that it doesn't lead anywhere. Many times it leads to actual negative results. You want to keep that in mind. That's what we have mindfulness for. Remember, mindfulness isn't just being aware of the present moment. If you were solely aware of the present moment and nothing else, you would have no memory of what had worked and hadn't worked in the past, what was skillful, what wasn't skillful. You'd be totally at sea. Mindfulness actually means keeping things in mind, reminding yourself that when something looks attractive, it's not necessarily good for you, may not lead you to happiness. And remember your experience with those thoughts in the past. Where did they lead? If you give in to lust, what happens? You get worn out, the level in the mind just falls and falls and falls. If you give in to anger, you're on fire all the time. Yet somehow we forget this. And the next time the impulse arises, we go with it again. It flashes a little gold our way, and we just run after it. It turns out, of course, to be fool's gold, but we forget. This is one of the reasons why we develop mindfulness, keeping the breath in mind, keeping the Four Noble Truths in mind. It means just this. Remembering what led to suffering in the past is probably going to lead to suffering again, no matter how attractive it may seem right now. Other practices that did lead the mind to clarity in the past will probably do it again. So even though the practices may seem difficult, you learn to inspire a sense of desire in yourself to do them. This is what the right attitude toward the right effort is all about. As the Buddha said, one of the customs of the noble ones is to delight in abandoning, and to delight in developing. This means, of course, to delight in abandoning unskillful mental states, and to delight in developing skillful ones. Which is just the opposite of where most of us go. We delight in the unskillful things, we want to keep developing them. And we don't delight in developing the skillful ones. Ajahn Suwat once had a comment. He said, look right there at the things you like, that's where you're going to find the cause for stress, the cause for suffering. So you've got to learn how to look past the appearances of things, and realize that this really does require work. When the Buddha talks about seeing things as they really are, it doesn't mean simply accepting that the way we are is the way we're going to have to stay forever. We should also see that we have the potential to get rid of unskillful states. As the Buddha said, if it weren't possible to get rid of them, to totally be free of them, he wouldn't teach us to do it. But he did teach that you can be free of these things. There's some confusion around the phrase knowledge and vision of things as they are. Actually, the phrase is knowledge and vision of things as they've come to be. It's a special kind of knowledge in which the results of past karma arise, but you don't create any new states of becoming out of them, and you don't try to destroy them, either. This knowledge comes at the very end of the path. After you've gotten rid of greed, anger, and delusion, so that you can see these things as they actually arise. If greed, anger, and delusion are still arising, you can't see things as they've come to be, because you've already jumped in and have gotten involved in creating a state of becoming around them. So as long as there are defilements in the mind, we have to admit that, yes, these are defilements. It's one of those words that we here in the West don't like. There's nothing defiled about my mind, most people say. Of course, that's the defilement of pride right there. So you have to admit, yes, these things do defile the mind, they make it darker, they make it more obscure, and some of them require real work before we can get rid of them. But once you get the hang of it, it's pleasant work as you're developing mindfulness, alertness, concentration, discernment. These are good qualities to have in the mind. They do depend on desire, but it's good desire. The Buddha didn't say that all desire was bad. After all, the ability to generate the desire to engage in skillful effort is an important part of right effort. It's a desire to be developed, to be praised, to be encouraged. So although it is true that some defilements go away simply by watching them, that's only one of many approaches you need, only one of many aspects of right view. If you try to make it a blanket approach, you turn it into a wrong view, wrong effort, wrong all down the line. Right view sees that many different approaches are needed in the practice to deal with the many tricks of the defilements. And right effort is willing to do whatever is needed for that particular case, that particular defilement, or that particular skillful quality in the mind. You have to broaden your view. Don't hope that simply having a hammer in your toolbox is going to enable you to build a house. You need the hammer and the saw and the chisel and all the other tools, and the Buddha provides us with a full range. An important part of the skill, an important part of right view is learning how to master all the tools and how to read the situation, so you can figure out what's needed. In that way, when you have a well-rounded understanding of right view and right effort, it helps all the other elements of the path to become right as well. Feeding your attack dogs. May 27, 2008. A couple of years back I read an account by a woman who had been on a meditation retreat. You've probably heard about Vipassana romances, and she had a really bad case. She suddenly fixated on a young man who was also on the retreat, a very strong sense of desire. She found that she couldn't be in the meditation hall with him, so she went off to meditate in her own room. And that's when she realized, or so she said, that it wasn't just her personal desire she was feeling. It was desire as a cosmic force running through her. And she wasn't responsible for it, so it was all okay. It's scary to think that this person is now a meditation teacher, teaching people about cosmic desire, or whatever. She'd missed an important point in what the Buddha taught about desire. That when these things come into the mind, it's not cosmic forces acting through you, it's your old karma. These thoughts that spring up over you and suddenly take you off in different directions. You're sitting here meditating, minding your own business, very dutifully working with the breath, and then suddenly you find yourself off someplace else. The fact that there was the initial impulse to go someplace else. That's past karma. The present karma is your decision at some point to go along with it. You're hardly conscious of it. The fact that you did make a decision is because these things operate so far below the radar level of the ordinary mind. This is one of the important issues you have to face in your meditation. That a lot of decisions are going on behind the walls you've erected in the mind, and you don't like to think about the decisions you're making. But the fact is, you are. And you've got to bring your radar down so that nothing can go below it. So prepare yourself for the fact that the mind is going to leave the breath. There will be a lot of vagrant intentions that don't fall in line with the initial intention, which was to stay here with the breathing, to try to stay concentrated all through the hour. You've got to watch out for the present karma of when you decide to suddenly slip off to contemplate what you're going to do next week, or what you did last week, or what you'd like to have for a meal tomorrow, or how you're upset about something somebody said or did, or how you're embarrassed about something you did a while back. These things are going to come up. And you've got to be prepared to notice the stirrings in the mind when they're just in incipient form, so you can catch them in time and reaffirm your intention to stay here with the breath, to enjoy the breath. So you're dealing with a complex issue. A combination of past karma and present karma. While you're here, you want to watch out for the past karma. While you're here, you want to watch out for the present karma. Where does that past karma come from? All too often when we think about past karma, we think about previous lifetimes where you don't know who you were, or what you were doing, or why you're developing the habits you have. But past karma is often karma from today. Thoughts you had in the course of the day that you allowed yourself to wander with for a while. Well, that becomes a habit. And then that habit gets carried into the meditation. So when you're working on the mind, it's not just a matter of what you're doing while you're here sitting with your eyes closed, but also of what you do and think about during the rest of the day. The Buddha talks about anusaya, which is sometimes translated as latent tendency, sometimes as obsession. These latent desires, latent drives in the mind that we keep feeding, Throw them little scraps in the course of the day, so they get used to being fed. It's like a team of attack dogs that we keep penned up in the house. You don't want them to be too well fed, because then they get lazy and fat, and they won't attack intruders when you want them to. But if they stay too hungry, you're afraid they'll attack you. So you're constantly throwing them little scraps. If you don't, they're going to turn on you and eat you up. But actually, of course, they're gnawing on you all the time. And the more you feed them, the more they actually eat you up. If you don't want them to attack during the meditation, you have to learn how not to feed them at all, so that they ultimately die. There are 7 in all: sensual passion, irritation, views, uncertainty, conceit, passion for becoming, and ignorance. These are the things we keep feeding over the course of the day. If you find yourself getting interested in something really attractive, you're throwing a little scrap to sensual passion. Thinking about things that you feel righteously angry about, you are throwing some scraps to irritation and to views. And you do the same with ignorance and conceit. Comparing yourself with somebody else to feel that I'm okay as a person. It's amazing how in the course of the day, how often we compare ourselves to this person and that person, always finding somebody who is at least a little bit worse off than we are, so we can comfort ourselves with the idea that we're okay. Or you can focus on people who are way better than you are, and get yourself down in the dumps. Why the mind does that? What sort of satisfaction it finds there? Maybe it wants to say, well, I can't be expected to do such and such, because I'm nowhere near where that other person is. That fulfills a nefarious role in your attitude toward the meditation. Passion for becoming, the desire to think about this little world of thought, that little world of thought. We keep these thought worlds, these attack dogs, either for the purposes of using them against other people or for our own entertainment. Because part of us feels if we didn't have these forms of passion, we wouldn't have the impulse or the ability to survive. If we didn't nurture our sense of righteous anger, we wouldn't be able to fend off injustice. One of the lessons the Buddha taught is that you don't need to have these defilements in order to survive. You don't need to have them in order to work for what's right. And there's certainly no help in training the mind. There are a few you can use a little bit, as when Ananda talks about using conceit to give you confidence in your ability to handle problems in meditation, or when you use your passion for becoming to create good states of concentration, or irritation with your unskillful mental thoughts to get rid of them. So they do have their role, but you've got to watch out for the totally unskillful roles you give to these attack dogs. If you keep feeding them, they're going to expect to be fed all the time. When they find they can't get fed in your meditation, they attack. And part of you pretends that you haven't been doing anything, you don't know where they came from. These are cosmic forces over which you have no control. But you've been feeding them all throughout the day. You've got to watch out for that. Remind yourself, you're not Snow White, living with 7 cute and helpful little dwarfs. You're a suburban menace raising 7 attack dogs over which you have no control. This is why the Buddha taught restraint of the senses. As you look and listen and think in the course of the day, ask yourself, is this really helping in the practice, or am I feeding these attack dogs? Years back, when Ajahn Suwat was asked about how to bring meditation into the course of your daily life, he focused on the issue of precepts and virtue. Sila is the Pali word. Ordinarily, when we think about precepts, we think primarily about the 5 precepts. And that is one level of restraint, which is important for reining in some of these attack dogs. But Sila has other levels as well. Restraint of the senses is a kind of Sila, as is purity of livelihood. Reflection on how you use the requisites is a kind of Sila. Before you use food, clothing, shelter, and medicine, you ask yourself, why am I using so much? Is it really necessary for the purpose of the practice? As the Buddha realized when he was leaving his period of austerities, you do need to feed the body and treat it well enough, so it has the strength to give rise to good states of concentration. But you have to be careful not to overindulge, because otherwise the anusaya, this obsession of sensual passion, gets fed and gets used to wanting more food. So these various levels of sila are important parts of the meditation. We do the reflection on the requisites after as a group at the end of the day here. But it's important to keep that reflection in mind as you go through the day. That, combined with restraint of the senses and your general observance of the precepts, is what helps keep these attack dogs in line. It forms the kind of past karma that will be useful past karma when you're sitting here and meditating. If you haven't been feeding the dogs all day, and you've been alert to noticing when you're tempted to feed them, then you'll be more alert to them as you sit here and meditate. And that way they won't suddenly take over your meditation and devour it. Which means that this is an all-day, all-life practice. Many of us start out thinking, well, it would be good to have some stress reduction, or good to meditate in order to calm the mind down a little bit. But as you calm the mind, you find more and more that the peace coming from meditation is the only true form of happiness. Nathi santi param sukham, as the Buddha said. There is no happiness other than peace. The more you appreciate that, the more you realize what a full-time job it is to keep the mind peaceful, especially in modern society where there are so many demands on our time and the media use so many tricks for feeding our attack dogs because they want to make money off of our attack dogs. And rarely care who gets bitten in the process. You've got to watch out for that. At the same time, there's the general modern tendency to want to simplify everything. Meditation is just stress release or awakening is just getting the mind really still. There is that story of the woman who had a stroke, who described it as her awakening, and everybody likes to believe that's all it is, just cut off the left side of your brain, and everything will be okay. But the practice has lots of ins and outs, because past and present karma interact in lots of complex ways, requiring that we give them our full attention, if we're really serious about finding true happiness for the mind. And after all, it is your true happiness that you're after here. It's not like you're being sucked into some brainless cult. You're being asked to take your true happiness seriously, which you'd think people would do naturally. But they don't. The culture mitigates against it, and a lot of our own internal dishonesty mitigates against it. So it's going to take a while. It's a complex process to undo these tendencies, to undo these habits, these obsessions that we've developed. It's a full day, full lifetime process, but it's worth it. Because you ask yourself, if you're not giving yourself over to true happiness, what are you giving yourself to? You're just becoming food for your attack dogs. If you don't learn how to stop feeding them, they'll just keep feeding on you again and again and again, all day long, all life long, endless numbers of lifetimes long. You have to ask yourself, do you want to be subject to this all the time, or would you rather be free? When you're free, you're not the only one who benefits. There's an interesting passage in the canon where Mahakassapa was talking to Ananda, saying that during his first 7 days as a monk, he ate the alms food of the country as a debtor. But beginning with the 8th day, when he gained full awakening, he was no longer a debtor. That's because as an arahant, he had a totally different relationship to food. When he was eating food, it wasn't his attack dog's eating. He was simply eating out of the knowledge that he was going to stay alive long enough to live out his time, and was feeding to keep the body alive and useful during that period. A standard phrase in the Theragathas is one the arahants say. I don't delight in living, don't delight in dying, I live out my time, waiting my time as a worker waiting for his wage. So the arahants eat without obsession, and in doing so, as they use the requisites, the people providing the requisites gain a huge amount of merit. In fact, that's supposed to be one of the motivations we have for the practice, is that those who support us will gain a great reward, so that our consumption of things is actually a gift. That's an amazing thing. For most of us, consumption is just consuming, then it's gone, taking. And then to compensate for that, we try to give back something. But with the arahants, just the fact that they are so pure means that as you provide them with the requisites, anyone who is in any way involved in providing the requisites will gain huge rewards. So their consumption is actually an act of generosity. It's an act of giving. It's a very special way of living, so that instead of attack dogs eating, it's all giving. As that comment Ajahn Suwat made once, when someone told him, "This Buddhism you guys teach would be really good if you had a God to give you a sense of comfort, support, as you go through difficult parts of the practice." Ajahn Suwat's response was that if there were a God who could decree that by my eating everybody else would become full, I would bow down and worship that God. Well, awakening does that to some extent. The arhants, when they consume, they are giving. And if that's not miraculous, I don't know what is. Against Your Type. June 22, 2008. There's a passage in The Craft of the Heart, which is one of Ajahn Lee's first books, where he talks about 6 different personality types. In Thai the word is karat, in Pali, karita. There's the passion type, the aversion type, the delusion type, the intellectual type, the gullible type, and the worrying type. In listing these types, Ajahn Lee is obviously uncomfortable with them. He treats them because they were in the standard Dhamma textbooks that had been disseminated all over Thailand by that time, and which in turn were based on the commentaries. In fact, one of his reasons for writing The Craft of the Heart was to take a lot of the teachings from the Dhamma textbooks and treat them from the point of view of the forest tradition. So because these concepts were in the books, he had to treat them. He talks about them, and about the idea again from the commentaries that each has a particular type of meditation suitable for it. But then, at the very end of the discussion, he erases the distinctions. He says that, actually, all of us have all of these tendencies. It's not that people are types. We may have certain tendencies, certain habits that we develop over time, but we each have the full range of defilements. So we all need to have a full repertoire of techniques, a repertoire of skills, for dealing with them. This principle applies to meditation, and it applies to daily life as well, because we have the tendency to type ourselves. And either we like the type or we don't. If you like the type, you just say, "Well, I'm the person I am, and you have to accept it, that's the way it is, that's the way I'm always going to be." As for the people who don't like the type they've assigned themselves, they say, "Well, maybe I'm too assertive all the time, maybe I should be less assertive, or maybe I'm not assertive enough, and I should learn to be more assertive all the time." All of this misses an important part of the teaching, which is that instead of looking at things in terms of the sort of person you are, you want to look at each situation and ask, what's the appropriate action to do right now, in these particular circumstances? Again, this applies both in the meditation and in your practice outside of the meditation, where you practice in dealing with other people. You don't want to wake up in the morning and say, "I should be more assertive," and then go through the day just being more assertive willy-nilly. You need to read the situation. In which types of situations and with which sorts of people do you need to be more assertive, in which do you need to be less assertive, and how you can do it skillfully. I don't know how many warriors I've run into, people who just want to pick up a cause and fight no matter what, who haven't realized that the first principle of being a warrior is learning to choose your battles, realizing that some battles are just not worth fighting, so that you don't waste your time and energy on unimportant issues, and can give all your strength to the important ones. In other words, you want to be able to play lots of different roles, whichever role is appropriate for this particular set of circumstances, this particular defilement of the mind, or this particular situation outside. There's a skill to bowing out, just as there's a skill to fighting. Learn to develop a full range of skills. Instead of looking at yourself as a type of personality, see the issue more as a question of what range of skills you have, where your skills have not yet developed, and where they need more work. Because the fact that you've learned to be, say, unassertive in particular situations may be due to the fact it was the appropriate thing to do in those situations. So you don't want to drop that ability entirely. Just learn that there are other situations where you have to be more assertive. Or if you tend to have kind of a rough and ready personality, realize that there are times when it's better to be a little bit more refined, a little bit more restrained. So instead of acting out of the force of habit, you want to look at the situation outside and apply this approach. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that the habits you develop outside are going to apply to your meditation. The second is that, whether we like it or not, as Buddhists in the land of wrong view, we often stand for Buddhism in our actions. Whether people know we're Buddhist is not the issue. Someday they'll find out, and they'll ask, "Oh, is that how Buddhists act?" You don't want them to ask that question with that scathing tone of voice. You want them to say, "Oh, Buddhists tend to act in very appropriate ways." That's the impression you want to give because it helps them. And it's part of your training too. As you get more sensitive to situations outside and learn that you can approach them with an expanded set of skills, you start applying the same principle inside as well. Sometimes as you're meditating and things get dry, it might be wise to drop the breath for a little while and think of a topic that gives you a little more joy, a little more inspiration in the practice. Sometimes thinking thoughts of goodwill can help provide that sense of inspiration. Or you can recollect the Buddha and what a wonderful teacher he was. Here was someone who, after his awakening, had no need for anything from anybody, and yet he spent 45 years walking all over northern India to teach anyone who was ready to be taught. And he taught not because he wanted fame or recognition or approval from people. He taught because he had something good to share. It's really hard to find a teacher like that. The fact we have that kind of teacher is something we should take joy in. There's nothing in the Dhamma designed to rake money our way or to appeal to the defilements of the teacher. It's all straightforward truth, all straightforward beneficial teaching. As the Buddha said, things he would teach were 1. True, 2. Beneficial, and 3. Timely. So even though he's not here where we can see him in action, to see which teaching he would pull out for any particular situation, we can still apply his standards to learn from our own efforts. So if you find recollection of the Buddha inspiring, use it when you need it. Other times, when the mind is getting a little bit too carried away with itself, you've probably heard that there are times when desire can be part of the path, and you say, "Okay, any desire must be okay." Well, that's going beyond bounds. You've got to learn how to rein yourself in, exercise more restraint. In the teachings on breath meditation, the Buddha talks about times when the mind needs gladdening. In other words, you need to give it more energy. There are times when it needs steadying, and this can include giving it more restraint, making it more solid, more still, more circumspect. And then times when it needs releasing, when you find yourself burdening yourself down with unnecessary worries, unnecessary cares. Learn how to drop them, release yourself from those burdens. So it comes down to learning how to watch your mind and see what needs to be done, realizing that sometimes the amount of energy you need to apply to a problem is not the sort of level you normally apply. There are some people who really like to take a macho approach that whatever defilement comes up in the mind they're going to starve it. They go without food, they work themselves really hard, thinking that somehow the austerity is going to burn the defilement away. And that does work with some problems. That can be one tool you use, one tool that you keep in your tool chest, but it can't be the only tool. There are other defilements that require more precision, less brute effort, but demand a lot more from your powers of observation, so that you can understand where they're coming from. You want to have a wide range of skills. Instead of thinking of yourself as a particular sort of person who has to behave in a certain way, or is miserable with the way he innately is, just look at things in terms of your range of skills to see where they need expanding. You've got to develop other skills as well, which may seem less in character. But you're not here to stay in character. You're here to expand your character, expand your range of skills. Because that's a lot of why we suffer in life. We don't have a full range of skills for dealing effectively with greed, anger, and delusion, for dealing effectively with difficult people, for dealing effectively with friendly people, for dealing effectively with the mind when it's down, for dealing effectively with the mind when it's up. Instead of simply acting out of force of habit or deciding to change your habits in a very general way, you want to develop specific skills for specific situations. Learn how to read a situation and get a sense of what's needed. As you develop your powers of observation in this way, you benefit in lots of ways and the people around you benefit too. Your actions are more appropriate, and you're not tied to the force of habit. In this way, defilements that were recalcitrant become a lot easier to deal with because they have their skills too, you know. If you apply only one approach to them, they'll know you. They'll see you coming from 3 miles down the road because you telegraph your moves. They have their tricks, so you need to have your tricks too. There are times when they'll respond to harsh treatment, other times they'll respond only if you treat them very gently. So don't let yourself be limited by your sense of who you are. Know your range of skills and see where you need more practice. But think of it as that. A range of skills. You need more skills to deal with more situations. The question of who you are just gets put to the side because ultimately it's really irrelevant. The Buddha's teachings focus primarily not on types of people, but on types of actions. The types of action that gives rise to suffering, the types of action that can put an end to suffering. Dependent co-arising, the Four Noble Truths, emptiness. All the really big basic teachings are questions of action and result. That's how the Buddha wants us to look at things. That's what right view is all about. Seeing things in terms of actions and their results. Then you take that insight and use it to develop all the skills you need, as wide a range of skills as possible. When I first met Ajahn Fuang, I had a dream. I looked in his closet and saw that it was filled with all kinds of hats, each for a different role. He had a cowboy hat, a baker's hat, all kinds of hats in his closet. Then as I got to know him in real life, I realized that that's the sort of person he was. He had lots of different skills and could play lots of different roles. You could never really predict what his reaction would be at a particular time. You could depend on it in the sense that he would try to act in the most skillful way possible given a particular situation, but sometimes his sense of skillful was hard to predict. That's an aspect of right view that we tend to overlook, but it's really important. Work on your range of skills, work on your range of strategies. Because the defilements have their skills, they have their strategies. And if you establish yourself as a particular type of person, you're an easy mark for them. The wider the range of skills you have, the harder it is for the defilements to catch you. Thoughts with Fangs. June 24, 2008. There's a passage where the Buddha teaches Rahula how to take joy in the practice. He says, if you reflect on the things you've done, the things you've said, the things you've thought and you see that you didn't harm yourself, you didn't harm other people, that in and of itself is reason enough to take joy. Notice he doesn't say that if you reflect and see that you did better than somebody else, take joy in that. Because how do you measure better? If you're going to measure better, look at yourself. Are there areas where you used to act in a harmful way, but now you've learned to act in a less harmful way? Are there areas in which you used to act unskillfully and now you are more skillful? If you are going to make a comparison, make that kind of comparison. Because the practice after all is the practice in learning how to overcome suffering. Your suffering is a totally private matter in the sense that only you can experience your own suffering. Nobody else can look into your mind and measure how much you're suffering. And you can't look into other people's minds to see how much they're suffering. So whatever basis you might have for comparing yourself in the practice with other people is totally non-existent. Or to put it in another way, it can't be measured in any way at all. So if you find your mind slipping into that old issue of whether you're better than other people or worse than other people, realize that both sides have fangs. When you feel that you're better than other people, you tend to get complacent. When you feel you're worse than other people, you tend to get depressed. It's one of those perceptions of papanka, proliferation or complication. There's contact of the senses, and from contact there arises feeling. It's an interesting passage in one of the suttas where the Buddha starts out in a totally impersonal way like this. There's contact, and from the contact comes feeling. And then what you feel, you then label. All of a sudden you've come into the picture. And what you label, you think about. And what you think about, you tend to complicate. And then the complications turn around and bite you. You've been bitten by the categories of thought that tend to complicate matters or to proliferate in this way. The big category is thinking about yourself in comparison with other people. That really has fangs. It gets you worried about issues that really are useless. The real issue is, are you getting more skillful in learning how not to create suffering for yourself? This is not a narrow or selfish issue. After all, you hear about all the abuse that people inflict on others, and it's usually because they themselves are suffering. If they weren't suffering, they wouldn't inflict abuse. To the extent to which you can learn not to suffer, you are much less likely to harm others. That's the big issue. It has nothing to do with comparing yourself as better than or worse than or even equal to other people. The whole comparing mindset is out of order here. It's often related to the way we judge ourselves. Something doesn't go well in your meditation, something doesn't go well in your life, and you tend to judge yourself as a bad person. Something goes well and you tend to judge yourself as a good person. The reading, the judging of yourself is what gets in the way. When the Buddha was teaching Rahula how to look at his actions, at his words, at his deeds, the point was that he should try to purify the thoughts, the words, and the deeds. He wasn't focused on making himself a better person, the point was to learn how to respond to situations in a more skillful way. That's something you can evaluate, something you can learn from. If you make a mistake, you learn from the mistake and learn how not to repeat that mistake. If you do something well, remember that, take joy in that, and keep on training. In other words, when you look at your actions, don't make them a gauge of how good a person you are. That's where the fangs begin, and then they start you thinking about, well, am I better than that other person over there? Do they do a better job? Are they more generous? Are they more virtuous? Are they better meditators? Am I better than they are? However you answer those questions, that kind of thinking has fangs because it really obscures what you've actually done and what actually can be done to improve your habits or improve that particular action the next time that particular situation comes around. That's what the real issue is. Everything the Buddha teaches gets analyzed down into actions, intentions and their results. The intention you can gauge as to whether it's skillful or not, the results you can gauge as to whether they are skillful or not. What kind of person you are, how good or bad you are, that's not anything you can gauge at all. If you try to do it, it really gets in the way. So your duty here is to look at your intentions, and then to see how well those intentions play out when you act on them. And learn how to judge the results. Look at things simply in terms of cause and effect, and measure the effects in terms of whether they're harmful or not, whether they lead to happiness, or whether they lead to stress and suffering. It's all very simple, but we don't like things simple in that way. We like to complicate matters. And when we complicate things, our thoughts turn around and attack us. Learn to keep things pared down and simple. While you're sitting here and meditating, for instance, how is this breath? And then how is this breath? How about this one? How is your focus? Where are you focused? Is it working? Is it getting results? If you like the results, stick with what you're doing. If you don't like the results, you can change. As for the issue of how good a meditator you are, if that somehow pops into the mind, just let it pop out of the mind. It's really irrelevant. And it can get into the way of deeper insights. There's a passage where the Buddha mentions that it's a sign of an untrue person who, on gaining strong concentration, uses that attainment to measure himself against other people. I've got this attainment, they don't have this attainment. I'm better than they are, I'm a better meditator. That right there blocks the insight that could come from that attainment. The true meditator should reflect. The Buddha teaches non-fashioning even with regard to states of concentration and attainments along the path. Non-fashioning here means that you don't fashion a sense of self around these things. You simply see them as action and result. You look at the meditative state, not so much as a state, but as a product of what you're doing to create that state. And to what extent does it still involve stress and suffering? In what way could you create less stress and suffering? This reduces everything to actions and results. The type of person you are just gets put aside. So when you find the mind coming around and attacking you with those thoughts with fangs, learn to remind yourself, you're not here to compete with anybody else. You don't know who else is suffering and how much they are suffering. Even when they try to make a science out of happiness, they ask people to measure their happiness on a scale of 0 to 10. Well, happiness doesn't come with little numbers like that. It's all very subjective. It's not really a science at all. So on the one hand, you can't really measure how much someone else is suffering, and two, it's really irrelevant to the issue at hand, which is how much suffering are you creating right now? And how can you learn to create less? That's the only issue that matters. Remember that point and use it to cut through any other thoughts with fangs that come and attack you. And you find that just this simple analysis, cause and effect, action and result, can clear away a lot of problems and keep you focused on what's really important. A slave to craving. August 5, 2008. Ajahn Suwat once made the comment that we have everything all mixed up. We look at suffering or pain as an enemy. And we look at craving as our friend. When suffering comes, we push it away or we run away from it. But when craving comes, we tend to tag along. There's a sutta where the Buddha says that everywhere we go with craving as our companion. So we think that craving is a friend. It's always there with its arm around us. But as that passage we chanted just now reminds us, we're actually slaves to our craving. It's as if everywhere we go craving has us on a leash, pulling us this way, pulling us that. And as the Buddha noted, craving takes its delight now here and now there. There's nothing really steady or dependable about it. You want this taste here. You want that sight there. You want this experience over there. It's as if it's yanking you around all the time. And it's because of your likes and dislikes that it has you on that leash. You want pleasure, so it promises you pleasure. You're afraid of pain, so it threatens you with pain. If you don't follow your cravings, it's going to be horrible. You're going to be miserable. That's what it says. And we're not helped by the fact that modern psychology tells us if you don't go along with your desires, you're going to get all twisted and weird. And so we run along after the craving, even though it's never really produced anything that we could really hold on to for any length of time. Where are the pleasures that you experienced yesterday? Or last week? Or the year before? They're like the vapor of your breath on a lacquer tray. You breathe on the lacquer, and barely a second later it's gone. But the vapor on the lacquer tray at least doesn't leave a trace. Sometimes the memory of your past pleasures actually leaves a bad taste in your mouth. The things you did to get those pleasures, or simply the fact that they're not coming back. So what can you do to get beyond this slavery to craving? You've got to learn how to take a good hard look at pleasure and pain. Where is genuine pleasure and what is pain like? Why are you so afraid of it? To really understand these things, you have to get the mind in the right place. This is why we're sitting here meditating, so we can take a good look at pleasure, we can take a good look at pain, and come to understand them. When you really understand, then craving doesn't have any power over you. You cut the leash. You see how empty its promises are, and you see how empty its threats are. In other words, when you understand pleasure, you realize where genuine pleasure lies, and it doesn't lie in the pictures you create of it. Real pleasure is very different. It's something very quiet and cool here in the mind. It requires training to experience the pleasure that's really dependable and blameless, one that doesn't harm you, that doesn't harm other people, doesn't lead to intoxication. It's cool pleasure. It comes simply allowing the mind to be still for a while, not yanking it around. Or you can stay with the breath, and the breath is interesting enough, gratifying enough, pleasurable enough, so that the promise of other pleasures doesn't really pull you off course. This is part of the Buddha's strategy to show you there really are better pleasures that you can find here inside that don't cost any money. You don't put yourself in a position where somebody can catch you, like that peacock the other day. If that peacock hadn't been addicted to that birdseed, we would never have gotten it into the cage. And you look at the human society, the way people cheat other people. It's usually the person who's looking for a quick buck or a quick pleasure who gets taken advantage of. So you're a lot safer if you can find a sense of pleasure inside. As the Buddha says, when the mind is settled in concentration and is satisfied, when it has a sense of enjoying being here, Mara can't find you. Mara can't see you. This is even before you've gained awakening. So this is a safe pleasure. Once you see a safe and blameless pleasure, then you can look at the other pleasures you've had and weigh them for what they really are. All those images the Buddha has in the canon about the drawbacks of sensual pleasure. It's like carrying a torch against the wind. If you don't let go of it, it's going to burn you. Or like a hawk that's found a piece of meat. It flies off with the meat, and all the other hawks and kites and crows come and attack it. If it doesn't let go of the piece of meat, it's going to get killed. It's going to become a piece of meat itself. A lot of these images are pretty harsh. I know a lot of people don't like them because they really want to stay stuck on their old pleasures. But when you come from a different position, there is something really gratifying about listening to those images. It confirms what you've already seen, that the pleasure of jhana, the pleasure of concentration, is really a much better form of pleasure. And you are better off not running after those other things. This is one way in which you begin to cut the leash that craving has on the heart. When mind is solid enough, then you can start looking at pain, either physical pain or emotional pain. If you're coming from a position of well-being so that you're not pushing it away, you can actually see it for what it is. For example, pain in the body, we tend to get everything all glommed together. If there's a pain in your hip or a pain in your back, the pain in the hip and the pain in the back tend to get melded together so that the hip seems to be pain and the back seems to be pain. What you've done is you've taken different sorts of sensations and glued them together. On the one hand, you've got physical sensations. Sensations of solidity, what they call earth, liquidity, water, warm fire, energy, breath, or wind. Those things are purely physical. And then on top of that, there are the sensations of pain. If you glue the pain to the earth element or the sense of solidity of your body, the pain seems solid, and it becomes a lot more unbearable. But if you actually look at it and say, okay, which is the actual pain and which is the sensation of solidity? You see that they are different things. And the pain is very erratic. It moves, comes and goes, very, very quickly. If the mind is still enough and you can look carefully enough, you can begin to see, okay, when it moves in this way, it's because there's this perception in the mind. When the perception gets dropped, that particular pain gets dropped as well. Even though there may be a physical cause for the pain, it moves around a lot. And your perceptions try to keep up with it. And they form a bridge from the physical pain into the heart. If you can cut that bridge, sometimes there's the weird sensation of the pain actually going back into the heart and disappearing. In other words, it's the thread of pain that comes out of the heart that's been making you suffer. And even if the actual physical pain doesn't go away, when you can cut the bridge, you find that the heart can sit there in the midst of physical pain and not really be disturbed by it. This way you come to understand the pain, you come to understand pleasure. When you understand these things, the promises of craving lose a lot of their appeal, the threats lose a lot of their power. You can cut the leash, so you're no longer a slave. You're not being yanked around here and there. You've seen this false friend for what it is. Your slave master, and a very heartless and demanding one at that. But if you can really understand the principles of pleasure and pain and the actual motions and activities of pleasure and pain, you can get yourself out of slavery. This is why, as Ajahn Suwat said, you have to take pain as your friend, because you're going to learn an important lesson from it. But to be friends with pain, you need skill. That's the skill we're working on right now. The skill of getting the mind to be still, getting it to be mindful, concentrated, discerning. I know a lot of people who don't like these teachings because they sound harsh, but the only way you're going to get the mind out of its complacency is to show its stark reality. You think you've got this friend, but it's your slave master. And the thing you've been running away from all the time is the thing, if you actually turn around and look into it, is going to set you free. As today's session ends, we invite ongoing engagement. Just as Buddha advocated sharing teachings for the greater good, we invite your involvement. Aid in sharing these profound teachings universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your active role ensures these invaluable insights reach beyond boundaries. Seize this opportunity to ignite positive change and foster empathy. We eagerly anticipate your presence in future episodes, uniting to illuminate minds and nurture compassion worldwide.